One thing I've noticed about video games is that as video games have gotten older, two things have held true with this industry. One, development costs have gone up exponentially, and two, development time has also gone up with development cost. It's very common not to see sequels to games that appear on one console appear on the same console, or if they do, they appear very late into the generation. With Insomniac Games, their output in the past was nothing short of extraordinary. With this game, Spyro Year of the Dragon, this would mark the last PlayStation 1 game that Insomniac Games themselves would make for the Purple Dragon, and their last game on the PlayStation 1 in general. So did Spyro Year of the Dragon hit the mark and manage to hit the same highs as the last game, Ripto's Rage, and the first game that appeared in '98? I say yes, but also I have a caveat with that, and that is less is more. And that will become apparent later in the review. What is my history with Spyro Year of the Dragon? Well, Spyro Year of the Dragon was one of the first Spyro games I played. It's kind of weird. The series order I went in was 2, 3, then 1. I would play Spyro 3 Year of the Dragon at a friend's house and then would eventually get my own copy after I got my PlayStation 1 in about, I believe it was 2000 or 2001 is when I got Spyro Year of the Dragon. I would end up finishing Spyro Year of the Dragon more than once for this channel. One time for a Let's Play, one time for a live stream, one time for the charity event, and halfway for this review. I will be using footage from my previous playthroughs and the charity event for this review because I feel like I've played this game enough to really get an idea for it. And when I say I've played the game 3.5 times, I mean the original one. When it comes to the Reignited trilogy, which I'll get into later in the review, I have choice words for the Reignited trilogy's version. It's not bad, I just have questions about the character design. Now, that being said, how about we get into the story of Spyro Year of the Dragon, as I feel that this story is a lot more grand in scope than the previous games, but also not as big stakes, I guess? So, our story begins with Spyro the Dragon and the returning Hunter the Cheetah sleeping in a meadow with a bunch of dragons and dragon eggs. The dragon eggs, returning from the first Spyro the Dragon game, only a lot bigger than they were in that game, are going to be a main plot point for Spyro Year of the Dragon. As they are all sleeping, a rabbit hole forms up with a bunch of rhinoceros soldiers known as Rhinox appearing out of the holes and begin stealing the dragon eggs. As they are about to get away, Hunter the Cheetah's tail gets stepped on, waking up all the dragons and thus alerting them to the Rhinox as well as their leader Bianca stealing all the dragon eggs and going to the other side of the world known as the Forgotten Worlds. The Forgotten Worlds used to be a main place where dragons had lived, but the main villain of this game, the Sorceress, had banished them 1,000 years ago to the other side of the world, not realizing that the dragons were the source of magic for the Forgotten Worlds as a result. And because the dragons are gone, many of the portals inside of the Dragon World's Forgotten Realms are beginning to deactivate. To get the dragon eggs back, we have Spyro and Hunter going down the holes in order to find the dragon eggs because they're the only two that are able to fit inside the hole that Bianca had left open. Now, when it comes to the story of Spyro Year of the Dragon, I feel it's a grander scope than in what it was inside of Ripto's Rage because the collectible is actually tied to the main story. And while you could argue that was the case for the orbs in Spyro 2, Ripto's Rage, I feel that the orbs were kind of added in for the last world because they didn't want to do another set of talismans for the last homeworld. And that's one thing I will give praise to Year of the Dragon for. They managed to return it to a form that the first game had done with Year of the Dragon, and Year of the Dragon allows for a reason to care about the collectibles, I find. because you can get through most of Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage without getting most of the orbs. There's 64 orbs in that game. You only need 40 in order to beat the boss. And while you don't need all of the dragon eggs in order to beat the sorceress at the end of the game, you do want to because of some gameplay mechanics that were added in and a new world, as well as a true epilogue and true hidden final boss. When it comes to the characters in the story, I do like most of the characters and the returning characters. Hunter has a lot more personality to him than just being a cocky rival to Spyro. And Bianca is an interesting character, and not realizing that she's being lied to by the sorceress and having information withheld on purpose. And then we have the sorceress herself. The sorceress, I find, is a good antagonist, but she doesn't hit the same highs for me as Ripto did in the second game. Ripto has what I like to consider gremlin energy. He's short, loud, obnoxious, and has the power to back up his snarls. The sorceress kind of just sits and sends her minions after you throughout the game, and really only gets her own hands dirty for the final boss. I feel that with Ripto, who was ever present for Spyro to see, it was a better fit, but Spyro actually doesn't meet the sorceress until the end of the game when you fight her in the final boss. Unlike in the second game where Ripto was always present and being the one causing problems in Avalar that Spyro himself would see. When it comes to the other characters in the game, we also have the animal friend buddies, which include Sheila the kangaroo, Sergeant James Bird, Bentley the Yeti, and Agent 9 the monkey. Out of all of them, they all have an interesting quirk to them, but it's one of those Donkey Kong 64 situations for me where I feel that they expanded the roster too much to add in new gameplay styles and justify it with those new characters rather than having Spyro himself do it. But onto the gameplay now. We have a bunch of different gameplay styles in Spyro Year of the Dragon. We have a total of 7 different gameplay styles for characters alone. That's not counting mini games returning in from Spyro 2. We have Spyro's main gameplay, which remains largely unchanged from the first 2 games. You go around the maps collecting treasure that is scattered across the ground or inside of enemies once again. We have Spyro going around finding eggs in different hidden nooks and crannies or doing certain mini games. Then we have Sparks missions, which were added into the game, where you play as Sparks in a shmup style shooter and would be able to get new power-ups for Sparks after beating those levels. Then we have the animal friend, which each 4 of them have a different gameplay style. Sheila the kangaroo being a high vertical platformer, Sergeant Bird being flying around missions and shooting your rocket launchers at enemies in the air, Bentley the Yeti being big, smart, and smashing things with a club, and Agent 9, or as I like to call him, Proto Ratchet, who strafes around and shoots his laser gun at different enemies and has an interesting Doom clone mission in one of the levels. Then we have Hunter the Cheetah, who has his own missions in this game, which are tied in through the returning speedways. The speedway missions for Hunter are different and all have a revolving story around the returning flying alien sheep from the second game wanting revenge on Hunter for whatever reason, and usually always having an egg on hand. Now, speaking on speedways, we do have new gameplay mechanics in the speedways as well, as not only do we have the returning time trials, we also have the new races against the creatures in that world. Yeah, that's not even getting into all the different mini games in this game. Spyro Year of the Dragon has what I call Donkey Kong 64 syndrome, which is they added everything in the fridge to spice up gameplay, but I feel that they added a bit too much. And again, I feel that less is more sometimes in these games for collectathons, and having too much of a collectible can burn you out really easily. And some of the mini games in Spyro Year of the Dragon definitely add to that burnout. I'm looking at you, Yeti boxing in Frozen Altars. You're the absolute worst, and I have to do you 3 times. And it's not fun. It's not fun at all doing Yeti boxing or some of the other missions. But I will say that this game does add a catharsis in that once you end up beating the game, you unlock something that wasn't in the last game, but was in the first game. And that is an extra bonus world that is locked behind having all the rest of the treasure in the game and all the remaining dragon eggs before you go into the world. And once you beat all those, you get a special final boss battle against the sorceress and get an epilogue. Now, we do also have the returning skill points from the previous game, Ripto's Rage, and much like how it was inside of the second game, the third game, it's not really necessary, but it is nice to see where Insomniac would have liked to go had they continued with the Spyro the Dragon series. And that's not even saying on some of the worlds. Some of the worlds in Spyro 3 Year of the Dragon are amazing. Some of the best design that Insomniac did for the entire series, bar none. My favorite levels include Frozen Altars. Another one that I love is the Crystal Islands. Crystal Islands, just for a visual aesthetic standpoint, just look really good. And I always enjoy going inside of the other Icy level, Icy Peak. Overall, the gameplay, while it's definitely suffering from Donkey Kong 64 syndrome, is still very concise and very well polished, along with the graphics in the game. This game continues the graphical fidelity that the previous 2 Spyro games had, which is pretty high standard for the PlayStation 1. And I will admit, I love a lot of the character designs inside of this game. I love the blocky nature of them. What I don't like is what the Reignited trilogy did to a lot of these designs. I do not like what they did to Bentley, and I don't even know where to begin with what they did to Sheila the kangaroo. Which, I mean, in the original game, Sheila was basically just an average kangaroo that talked. Kinda not as magical, but in the Reignited trilogy, they gave her a hairdo, a Outback style coat, and it's kind of just weird. It just doesn't look right to me. And another design that I really think actually damaged the image a lot to me is what they did to the sorceress. The sorceress's design in the original Spyro Year of the Dragon was a lot more big, a lot fatter, if that makes sense. And in the Reignited trilogy, they made her her face is too skinny for her body. I just really don't like it. And that's one thing that also goes into the voice acting, which I guess we can talk about sound design for Year of the Dragon now. Music for Year of the Dragon is once again handled by Stuart Copeland, and he does a great job like always. This being some of the best tracks the Spyro the Dragon series definitely has to offer, being my actual favorite soundtrack out of the original trilogy now that I think about it and have gotten older as time has gone on. And an interesting fact is, not all the tracks in the game are in every version of the game for the PS1. The Reignited trilogy, as well as the greatest hits version for the PlayStation 1, had 2 tracks added to them to replace other tracks in the game. So really, if you wanted the best soundtrack in the game, you would have to get a greatest hits version of Spyro 3 Year of the Dragon. Now, when it comes to the voice acting is phenomenal, especially for PS1 standards, on all the characters, all new characters, all returning characters. Everything that I did not like in the Reignited trilogy, I love on the PS1 original for voice acting. It's definitely the strongest in the voice acting category out of the entire trilogy. The same cannot be said for the Reignited trilogy. And really, this only, for me, applies to probably 3 voices in the Reignited trilogy. In the Reignited trilogy, I'm not a fan of the Sorceress's new voice actress, which in the original game, the Sorceress was voiced by Flo de Rey, and then in the Reignited trilogy by Cissy Jones. Cissy does an okay job, but I feel that the more threatening nature that Flo de Rey had for the Sorceress worked a lot better in the original Year of the Dragon. And I think it's because of the change in voice direction for the Reignited trilogy that kind of diminishes the overall threatening aura that the Sorceress had for me. Well, the new version of the game, she's not as threatening. She's more pompous. Another voice that I'm not a big fan of is Sheila the Kangaroo, with the original voice actress, Edita Bracha, being perfect for the role, I find, and then Chantel Berry being okay. The last voice, who I'm kind of going to say is grating, is Sparks the Dragonfly. They have him chatter a lot. Spyro 3 is an interesting game for me, as I've played it a lot in my life. A lot more than probably most people have ever even thought to really play it. It's fun to play through, but it's definitely one of the ones that I don't find myself going back to unless I absolutely have to. And that's not because it's a bad game, but because it's too long for what I'm looking for in a platformer. I kind of have the same issues, to speak of another rare game besides Donkey Kong 64, Banjo-Tooie. Banjo-Tooie is fun. It's more Banjo-Kazooie, but it's too long to get everything. And that's how I feel about Spyro 3 Year of the Dragon. It's a good game. It's more Spyro the Dragon, but it's just too much Spyro the Dragon for me at one time. I guess what I'm saying is I really enjoy the game, but 100%ing it is not the best, and at the same time, it just takes too long for me. Especially as I've gotten older, where time is a more valuable asset to me, it's definitely something that's just difficult for me to pin down and sit down to do this. And that's part of the reason why this review took so long. So ultimately, Year of the Dragon is a good send-off to the series, especially if you love the Spyro the Dragon series. But for me, who wants something more compact, it's not my favorite in the series that I'll go to. I'll go back to 1 and 2 before I go back to 3 entirely. But anyway, everyone, I'm gonna end it off right here. This has been Neronium, and I thank you all for watching my review of Spyro Year of the Dragon. Check out the Reignited trilogy, as that's the easiest way to get this entire package of Spyro the Dragon nowadays, as it's available on every major system. But until next time,